The room smelled like old carpet and printer ink. That's the detail I always come back to when I think about that morning. Not my brother's smug expression. Not the lawyer's careful neutrality. Not my mother sitting rigid in her chair like she was already rehearsing what she'd say at the press of a button. Just that smell. Institutional. Final. Like a place where things get decided and then stay decided. I had driven 3 hours from Sudbury to get there. My brother had flown in from Vancouver the night before and stayed at a hotel downtown, the kind with valet parking and a restaurant on the 32nd floor. I found out later he'd expensed it to the estate. That tells you most of what you need to know about how the two of us approached that day differently. My father had died 6 weeks earlier, pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors said was longer than average, as if that was something to feel grateful for. In some ways it was. He and I had time to talk. Real talk, the kind you don't do when you assume there will always be another Sunday, another fishing trip, another slow afternoon at the cabin. We talked about his regrets and mine. We talked about the business he had built over 40 years, a mid-sized commercial roofing company out of northern Ontario, the kind of company that employed 63 people and kept the lights on in a dozen families. He talked about what he hoped would happen to it after he was gone, and toward the end, when it was just the two of us, and he had enough energy to sit up and hold a cup of tea, he told me something I didn't fully understand until the morning I walked into that lawyer's office. He said, "Don't fight them, son, just be ready." I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was talking about grief. He wasn't. My name is Warren Holt, and for most of my adult life I have been the quieter one. That's how families work sometimes. Someone gets assigned a role early, and the role sticks. My brother is 4 years older, and from the time we were kids, he was the one with the strong opinions and the louder voice, and the easy charm that made strangers remember his name. I was the one who fixed things when they broke. I learned the business from the inside out, starting as a labourer during university summers, moving into estimating, then project management, then operations. By the time I was 34, I was running the day-to-day. My father was still the face of the company, but I was the one who kept it breathing. My brother had a different path. He went into finance, moved west, did well for himself. He came home at Christmas and called our father every couple of weeks. He wasn't absent, but he also wasn't there. He didn't know the names of the foreman, or which flat roof membrane system worked better in a freeze-thaw climate, or how to renegotiate a supplier contract when material costs spiked. He knew what the company was worth on paper. That's a different kind of knowledge. When Dad got sick, I moved back to the family property outside of town. I spent weekends helping him manage medications and appointments while still running the company during the week. My brother flew in twice. Both times he stayed at the same hotel downtown. I don't say any of this to make him a villain. I say it because context matters, and because what happened later only makes sense if you understand what was already there before the crisis arrived. My mother sided with my brother. I don't know exactly when that happened, whether it was a single conversation or a slow drift over years, but by the time my father's diagnosis became serious, she had already decided what the outcome should look like. She wanted the company sold. She wanted the proceeds split. She wanted everything wrapped up cleanly, like a box you could close and put on a high shelf. I understood the impulse. Grief makes people want simple solutions, but selling the company meant putting 63 people out of a job or into the hands of a buyer who had no stake in their well-being. It meant dissolving something my father had spent his life building. It meant making the decision quickly, before the estate was even settled, because my brother had already found a buyer and my mother had already said yes. No one had asked me. The first time I realized something was wrong was about 2 months before my father died. I came home from the office early one afternoon and found my mother on the phone in the kitchen. She stopped talking when she heard me come in. The silence lasted a half-second too long. She said she'd call back later and set the phone down on the counter. "Who was that?" I asked. "Just your brother," she said, checking in. I didn't press it. There was too much else to manage. Dad was having a harder week. The company had a contract dispute with a general contractor in Timmins that needed my attention. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't. 3 weeks before my father passed, he asked to speak with his lawyer alone. He'd already had the main estate documents drawn up months earlier, but he wanted to make an amendment. He didn't tell me what it was. He just called me into the room afterward, took my hand and repeated what he had said before. "Don't fight them, just be ready." This time I asked him what he meant. He smiled the way he always smiled when he thought I already knew the answer to my own question. "You've been running that company for 6 years," he said. "You know every contract, every client, every person on that crew. Your brother knows the sale price. There's a difference between those two kinds of knowing, and eventually that difference will show up." He squeezed my hand. Trust the work you've put in. He died on a Thursday morning in late October, with the maple out the window already bare. The lawyer's office was on the 4th floor of a building near the courthouse in downtown Sudbury. Pale walls, grey carpet, a boardroom table with a water carafe no one touched. My mother sat across from me. My brother sat beside her. His wife had stayed home in Vancouver. He'd brought a colleague instead. Not a lawyer exactly, more of a financial advisor, a man in his early 50s, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent decades being the most prepared person in rooms like this. I came alone. When everyone had settled, our family's lawyer, a steady, unhurried man named Mr. Okafor, who had handled my father's affairs for 15 years, placed a document in the center of the table. He explained the primary structure of the estate, the property, some personal assets, and the company. Then he mentioned the amendment. My mother's posture shifted. My brother glanced at his advisor. Mr. Okafor said my father had prepared a sealed letter to accompany the amended will. He opened a manila envelope and slid a smaller, sealed envelope across the table toward me. My brother said, "What is that?" "It's addressed to your brother," Mr. Okafor said, in the mild tone of someone who has delivered complicated news to families for a long time. It was included with the amendment instructions. "Your father asked that it be opened in this meeting." My mother said, "We weren't told about any letter." "No," Mr. Okafor said, "you weren't." I held the envelope for a moment. My brother's advisor leaned forward. My mother's jaw was tight. I think some part of them expected me to hesitate, or to look confused, or to ask for a recess. Instead, I broke the seal and read. My father's handwriting was shakier than it used to be, but clear. He wrote that he had watched me carry the company for years without complaint and without recognition. He wrote that he knew what had been discussed in his absence, the sale plans, the buyer conversations, the timeline my brother and mother had been quietly assembling. He wrote that he trusted me to handle what came next, and that the amendment would ensure I had the tools to do it. The amendment divided the estate in a specific way. The property and most of the personal assets, the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, went to my mother and brother to be split according to the existing formula. The company, however, was handled differently. Control of the company's operating structure, its contracts, its equipment, and, critically, its bonding and licensing credentials, which in commercial roofing are worth more than almost anything else and take years to accumulate, went to me in a trust structure my father and Mr. Okafor had spent months preparing quietly. My brother could contest it. He could attempt to force a sale, but the bonding credentials couldn't be transferred in a sale. They were held in a trust structure tied to my continued operation of the company. Any buyer would have to start from scratch on licensing. The company my brother had found a buyer for, the one with the clean balance sheet and the good reputation and the existing client contracts, was worth roughly what my brother believed it to be. The company without its bonding and licensing was worth considerably less. My father had understood exactly what he was doing. My brother sat very still for a long moment. Then he looked at his advisor. The advisor looked at the documents. My mother looked at me. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. My brother's first response was anger. That was predictable. He said the amendment had been made when our father was not in a sound state of mind. He said the process had been irregular. He said there would be a challenge. His advisor was already on his phone, presumably calling someone. My mother said very little, which surprised me. She had always been the one to fill silences with urgency. But she looked older than she had when I walked in. Something in her face had shifted, and I think what I was watching was the moment a plan she had built quietly over months collapsed in the space of a few sentences. I drove home the same afternoon. On the highway north, I stopped at a Tim Hortons and sat in the parking lot for a while with a medium coffee, and the windows fogged from the cold. I expected to feel triumphant. I mostly felt tired. Not the tiredness of defeat, but the kind that comes after something long and uncertain finally resolves. My brother hired a lawyer. The challenge took 8 months. I kept the company running throughout. When the legal process concluded, the amendment held. I want to be clear about what that period actually looked like, because I think when people hear a story with a satisfying ending, they sometimes imagine the middle was easier than it was. The 8 months were hard. My brother didn't only pursue the legal challenge. He also reached out to some of our larger clients, commercial property managers, general contractors we'd worked with for years, and suggested the company was in uncertain territory, that the estate dispute might affect our ability to fulfill contracts. 2 clients put our bids on hold. A third called me directly and asked if we were stable. I answered his questions honestly and walked him through the legal structure and the trust arrangement. And he stayed with us. The other 2 came back once the challenge was dismissed. My mother stopped speaking to me for most of those 8 months. We had one conversation in February, in the parking lot of the hospital where she'd had a routine appointment. She looked tired. I asked how she was. She said she didn't understand why I hadn't just agreed to sell. I told her that selling would have meant the end of something Dad had spent his life building, and that 63 people depended on. She said that was a lot of weight to put on one decision. I said I knew. We stood there in the cold for a minute, and then she got in her car. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was honest. And with my mother, honest was always more possible than warm. My brother's advisor had assured him the challenge had strong grounds. What the advisor hadn't fully accounted for, or had underestimated, was the documentation my father and Mr. Okafor had assembled. My father had been careful. He'd been assessed by an independent physician the week before signing the amendment, and the report was in the file. He'd had a second lawyer present as a witness. Every procedural standard had been met. The challenge was thorough, and the opposing lawyer was competent, but the foundation wasn't there. By September, it was done. I remember the morning Mr. Okafor called with the final ruling. I was on a job site in Elliott Lake, standing on a flat roof in the early morning, watching the sun come up over the lake in a long flat line of gold. He told me it was over. I said thank you and hung up and stood there for a while. One of the foremen, a man who had been with the company for 19 years, walked over and asked if everything was all right. I said yes. Good, he said, and handed me a coffee from his thermos without any further comment, which is exactly how people from Northern Ontario handle moments like that. I think about that moment more than I think about the lawyer's office, or my brother's expression when the letter was read, or any of the dramatic moments that are easier to point to. What stayed with me was the normalcy of it. The work was still there. The crew was still there. The sun on the lake was still there. The thing I had been afraid of losing was still intact. My brother and I are not close. We speak at family events and manage our interactions with a particular politeness of people who have chosen not to escalate further. I don't know if we will eventually get somewhere better than that. I hope so, but I don't hold it as a condition for my own peace of mind. My mother and I have rebuilt something. It took time and some difficult conversations, and a willingness on both our parts to stop narrating the past and talk about the present. She came to the company's 40th anniversary dinner last spring. We held it at a hall in town, and about 120 people came, crew members and clients and their families. She sat at a table with 2 of the foremen and their wives. And by the end of the night, she was looking at a photo album one of the older guys had brought. Pictures from the early days when my father was young, and the company was 3 trucks and a phone number. She was crying quietly. I sat with her for a while. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. The company is doing well. We took on a major municipal contract last year, a multi-year maintenance agreement with a regional government that represents the largest single contract in the company's history. We brought on 6 new employees in the spring. My father's name is still on the door. People sometimes ask me whether I resent the way things unfolded, whether I'm angry at my brother for trying to take what my father intended for me, whether I'm hurt that my mother chose a side. I'm honest when I answer. I was angry for a while. There were nights in those 8 months when the weight of it, the legal fees, the client uncertainty, the silence from my mother, the pure exhaustion of keeping everything moving, while also defending my right to keep everything moving, felt like more than one person should have to absorb. But my father was right about something. When you know something from the inside, when you've been present for the hard parts and not just the rewarding ones, when you understand something not from a spreadsheet but from years of actual contact with it, that knowledge doesn't disappear because someone challenges it. It holds, and eventually, the difference between that kind of knowing and the other kind shows up. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being the person who stays when others leave, who carries things others don't want to carry, who is so reliably present that people begin to treat your presence as background. I think a lot of people understand that feeling from different corners of their lives, from families, from workplaces, from relationships, the feeling of being load-bearing without being acknowledged, of keeping something alive while others plan around your absence. If that's familiar to you, I'd say the same thing my father said to me, adapted slightly. Don't fight to be seen by people who have chosen not to look. Put the work in, know what you know, and be ready for the moment when the difference finally shows up, because it will. I still go to the cabin a few weekends each year. It's on a lake about 40 minutes outside of town, the same one my father built with his own hands over 3 summers in the 70s. The deed transferred to me as part of the estate. I don't take it for granted. I take my kids out there when I can, my daughter who is 9 and has her grandfather's patience, and my son who is 6 and has his grandfather's stubbornness, and we fish off the dock in the mornings before the wind picks up, and we eat sandwiches on the steps, and I try not to talk too much about the past. But sometimes, when the light is right, and the kids are busy, and the lake is still, I think about my father sitting in this exact spot, and I think about what it costs to build something honest in a world that doesn't always reward honesty immediately. And then I think about the fact that he knew all of that, and built it anyway, and trusted me to understand. That understanding turned out to be worth more than anything that could have been awarded, challenged, or sold.